This week in the enterprise security news, Mimecast challenges Shadow IT for cloud app usage. CloudKnox announces integration with AWS IAM Access Analyzer. Lots of AWS news, as there was a AWS Reinvent, I believe, recently. Morphisec achieves AWS security compliance status. And much more. In our second segment, we welcome back Farah Mavatuna, founder and CEO of NetSparker. We're going to discuss how to start building a web security program, some realistic approaches on how to actually start building a DevOps practice in a CI/CD pipeline. And then our final segment is Heather Pawnett, the VP of Product at Untangle, to talk about Untangle's upcoming SD-WAN router. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Networks are becoming increasingly complex and fragmented, and digital transformation and DevOps are driving an explosion in network connectivity changes. With each new network connection, cyber attackers may gain another opening to breach or traverse the network. At Tufin, they've pioneered a policy-based approach to network security management using automation and analytics. As a result, you can make network changes in minutes instead of days, reliably and securely. To learn more about Tufin, the security policy company, go to securityweekly.com/Tufin and sign up for a free evaluation. By the end of 2020, 99% of exploited vulnerabilities will be publicly disclosed and known to IT system admins. The consequences of that fact means the burglar will already be in your house because you left the front door wide open by failing to patch known vulnerabilities. How can you keep the threat actors out? Through cloud-based automation, Automox enables you to slam the door on unpatched OS and third-party vulnerabilities across your entire Windows, Mac, and Linux infrastructure. Take advantage of a free trial with Automox to not only see the vulnerability status of your infrastructure, but do something about it within minutes. Start automating the fundamentals of cyber hygiene at securityweekly.com/Automox. That's securityweekly.com/Automox. Most cloud threats are your responsibility, not your cloud service providers, and prevention-based security isn't enough on its own. That's why Gartner predicts that 60% of enterprise security budgets will go towards detection and response in 2020. ExtraHop RevealX Cloud delivers cloud-native network detection and response for the hybrid enterprise, the only SaaS-based NDR solution for AWS. Request your 30-day free trial of RevealX Cloud at extrahop.com/trial. That's extrahop.com/trial. Welcome, everyone, to episode 164 of Enterprise Security Weekly for December 4th, 2019. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Mr. John Strand. It's been MIA for a while, John, and you're back. Nice to have you back.
I think it's been like 6 weeks.
Yeah, you've been traveling and all kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah, lots of fun stuff.
Hopefully fun stuff and not fun stuff.
Dude, it was all great. The thing in Adele with the sheriff that threw those pen testers in jail. Mm-hmm. He actually came and talked to us. It was fantastic. But as I was telling Matt, just too much travel. But no, I'm now here, and I'm here through January, so we should be good to go.
Outstanding. Mr. Matt Alderman is here with us as well remotely. Matt, welcome.
Hello. The calm before my storm, which is a move this weekend. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
Hopefully the last move for a while.
It better be, because I can't do this again.
Cool. So let's see. Announcements. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30th through April 1st at Disney's Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners get 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or a World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2020 and click the register button to register with our discount code. We're also running our annual listener feedback survey where we collect information from you anonymously to help make our shows better. Go to the securityweekly.com website and click the survey link at the top of the page. And now the news for this week. Did we want to cover, there were some acquisitions, and I know we were kind of light on that. Was the third one Sonatype?
Yeah, I believe so. The first one that popped up on the radar was Tenable's acquisition of Indegy, which is an operational technology ICS SCADA vendor.
Oh yeah.
We've covered them. We've covered that space before on one of the shows. There's kind of like four main guys in that space. Security Matters was acquired earlier this year, I think, by Forescout. So this was an interesting acquisition by Tenable to expand some capabilities into the operational technology side. People who know the Tenable solution, they have the passive sensor that can detect through network traffic assets and vulnerabilities. My guess is this will augment that to add additional protocols to also do that for the operational technology side.
Yes. And then what was the other acquisition?
Protego was acquired by Checkpoint.
Yes.
Which is, and we covered Palo Alto last week. So this is really interesting if you dig into it. And John, I don't know if you've seen the same kind of trend, but Palo Alto's acquired some really interesting application container serverless platforms. Checkpoint is now kind of following suit.
Yeah.
They bought ForceNock earlier this year. Then they did some work. Protego, I think, is a serverless capability, I think. So you're seeing Checkpoint kind of follow suit a little bit on this application container serverless acquisition path. They're kind of interesting. They're kind of paralleling each other right now.
Yeah. Well, I got a question. With Palo Alto, do you think that they're kind of in the lead in picking up the best firms and Checkpoint's kind of picking up the runts? Or is it not quite that simple?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Checkpoint's picking up the runs, but certainly what we've stated on the show several times is Palo Alto's acquisitions are pretty much spot on. I mean, they're companies that were like, yeah, they're making stuff that solves people's problems. So,
yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Palo Alto's the first to the is making the first play.
Yeah.
I think they're actually setting the bar on who's getting acquired in some respects, right, wrong, or indifferent. But the Twistlock acquisition was, probably the leading container security vendor out there. I mean, Aqua might debate that a bit, but Twistlock's been around for a while, and Palo Alto buying Twistlock really put some pressure on the other container security vendors in the space. So I think it's just Palo Alto's vision right now is interesting. I think, Paul, you and I talked about this a little bit last week, is they're making some very interesting moves that align to where I think the market's going to go, but they're moving first, and then the others are following. So to your point, John, if Palo Alto's buying best in breed, what's Checkpoint going to buy? They're going to buy maybe second or third best in breed, depending on when they pull the trigger.
Yep.
Also in the news this week, we're discussing just before the show started the Nss Labs. The article stated dismisses antitrust complaint against anti-malware testing standards organization and endpoint security vendors. What does this all mean?
So I think a lot of this goes back to Nss Labs versus CrowdStrike. It was a case that was brought up in Delaware a number of years ago. And what had happened is CrowdStrike didn't play with Nss Labs testing, and they didn't look very good. Nss Labs tries to create this Gartner Magic Quadrant type thing with the different endpoint security vendors. And as I said, CrowdStrike said, no, we're not going to be part of it. Nss Labs was able to get a copy of CrowdStrike through a different means from another license that was actually purchased for it. So CrowdStrike tried to block the Nss Labs report from being released because they said it wasn't fair. And the judge basically dismissed the entire thing out of hand, out of Delaware, primarily referencing the Consumer Fairness Protection Act of 2016. So CrowdStrike said if Nss Labs acquired their licenses, there is a gag clause in their license agreement that says that you're not allowed to talk about the product, or you're not allowed to do any comparative analytics against that product. And the Consumer Fairness Protection Act of 2016 basically retroactively invalidated every single one of those statements in every contract everywhere. So the point is, if you have a contract from a vendor and it says you can't test our product, you can't compare our product to other people, and you sure as hell can't talk about our product negatively to other people, that clause is completely illegal.
And now we have case law to back that up.
Yep, now we have case law to back that up. So as I said, that was out of Delaware, I believe. So okay, so now let's take what happened there. The judge basically dismissed the case and said, even if CrowdStrike is right, then they should produce their own report showing Nss Labs is wrong. This will create conversation. This will create data, and it's good for the consumer when that happens. So far, so good. So looking at this, it looks like Nss Labs it was trying to shut down basically all the vendors getting together and creating their own anti-malware testing organization. If I'm reading this right, this is like 4 paragraphs. I'm sure that there's legal documents that we haven't had time to look into. And the people that were in this were Crowdstrike, Symantec, ESIT, anti-malware testing standard organizations, and DOES 1-50. They were all the people that were part of this lawsuit. But it looks from Nss Labs quote, they basically said, Nss Labs said, during the past year, AMSTO has made great progress to be more fair and balanced in its structure. Vendors have shown progress in working with testing organizations, and the market itself has significant change, notable acquisition activity. So I think that's why Nss Labs removed this particular case. So basically, as near as I can tell, Nss Labs for a long time was the only game in town for AV comparative testing, as far as many people were aware. There's some other ones that are out there. And they didn't like the idea of a new organization being created that kind of stepped on their toes. So I think that's where this all stands, but I'll do some more research before the next show.
But the Anti-Malware Testing Standards Organization, who created that?
Well, from what we're reading right here, it sounds like whenever the Anti-Malware Testing Standards Organization, the way that they structured their tests, it appeared like it could have been set up to favor certain vendors and what they're actually doing. So whether or not it was created by, AV vendors or other people, it sounds like to me it was irrelevant. It sounds like it was very favorable to certain vendors, and that's specifically what Nss Labs was fighting against. By the way, I want everybody to understand, just so you're completely clear, I think Nss Labs testing methodology is complete and utter garbage. I'm not defending them. I don't agree with how they actually do things. But whenever it comes to being sued by companies, I will take Nss Labs' side every single time. They should be able to do their testing the way they see fit without interference.
And there are other sources for this data. I mean, we when we were covering, we did an Endgame interview a few weeks back, Paul. I know there were some other reports we were looking at. So there are other testing sources out there. So Nss Labs isn't the only game in town either. And so there are different sources to get this stuff. And as long as there is some level of transparency in the testing and the results of those testing, so everything is fair across the board, I don't care who does it.
Yeah. One of the things that bothered me with previous Nss Lab reports is they would test a vendor, and then they would invite that vendor to make configuration changes to their AV engine to better detect the malware that was actually triggered. And the reason why that's garbage is because in almost every AV package, it's how it's actually tuned and configured will determine how well it actually performs. So it's very hard to say Cylance is better than Carbon Black, which is better than CrowdStrike, even though I'm sure that they would love to disagree with me on that, but they're wrong. But the reason why you will be in one environment and CrowdStrike will perform better than Cylance is specifically how it's actually being configured. Are you actually restricting scripts like PowerShell scripts? Are you implementing application whitelisting with the product being enabled? Or are you just doing the heuristics and the AI parts of it? So whenever you're saying Nss Lab tested CrowdStrike or Cylance, that sucks because you don't know exactly what the configuration of that actually was.
I think we came to the same conclusion with vulnerability management as well. Having looked at independent tests and also, conducting your own tests, it's all about the configuration, and it's also about your environment, right? It's what's in or not in your environment at any given time. And how do you test how can you conclusively say that something's better than something else in that level of detail, right? I think your criteria has to be expanded in all these cases to talk about pricing and packaging and usability, which again is kind of arbitrary, right? Left up as an exercise to the user, but also how does it fit operationally in your environment? And all those factors come into the evaluation criteria.
And I think that that's so on point, right? But ultimately that comes down to training and the overall skill sets of organizations, and if they even have that capability to do that type of assessment on their own.
Yep. Well, I'm sure it's a topic that we will revisit and it'll never be, it's hard to produce results that say X is better than Y, right? In this type of security software where there's so many variables that change at any given time.
I think that honestly, we're kind of fighting the fact that it was. I mean, if you go back, Paul, like let's go back to 2005, 2004 timeframe. I think I met you in 2005-06 timeframe. And whenever we're looking at vulnerability assessment platforms, there was no question that Nessus was head and shoulders above everybody else. Rapid7 was a hot mess when it first came out. It was buggy, it would crash, it didn't do proper checking. It looked beautiful, but it was garbage. Qualys was actually pretty good for a while right out of the gate, especially when they had the contract with DoD. And then, or was it EI? EI.
Yep.
But we could say that definitively, that we could say, hey, Tenable, head and shoulders above absolutely everybody else. But over time, everyone started getting a lot better. And it kind of, that gap closed very, very quickly across many of these different vendors. And it became personal preference after a while.
Yeah, and I agree. A lot of it's personal preference, Matt.
Yeah, and subtle nuances.
Yes.
Right? It really depends on you know what you're looking for, right? If you want your stuff in the cloud, you're going Qualys. It's the best cloud platform out there, right?
Yep.
There's a lot of different nuances in the criteria, but at the end of the day, it's not really boiling down to the number of vuln detections, because I think they all do a good job and they're all basically the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe somebody has a little more Windows coverage and somebody has a little more Unix coverage. That's not where the differentiators are in those scanners anymore. There's other nuances, and it's all going to be based on your environment, your buying criteria, but it's going to boil down to probably less than a handful of those decision points, and then you know which vendor you're going to go with.
Yep.
A couple of AWS announcements. Did I get that right? AWS Reinvent happened?
Yeah, Reinvent
recently?
started on Monday. Yeah, I think it's still going. Yeah, but it officially started on Monday. Yes.
So now Amazon's going to release like 95 additional services and products. So
they did actually.
Yeah.
They announced a ton of new stuff. I don't even think we have that article in here to digest it. But what now you're seeing is all the security vendors now supporting different AWS deployment models. We see this every time there's a conference. All the product announcements come out. We support AWS blah 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 and this and that. So yeah, this is typical week.
One AWS new product that came out that I covered, I believe, yesterday on Hack Naked News was the IAM Access Analyzer. And I truly believe this is in direct response to the Capital One breach and those of us in the community talking about how it's difficult to know when you have all of these resources within AWS, what has permission to what. And the lack of visibility there, I think, was one thing that led to things such as the Capital One breach and lots of other breaches too, right? S3 buckets being exposed and in all types of breaches. This, I believe, is an effort by Amazon to allow customers to have an easier time gaining visibility and control over just what resources have access to each other, and doing the continuous monitoring. What I also find interesting is that security vendors are building that capability, or leveraging that capability into their own platform. So again, it comes down to our discussion. Do you just use what's in the cloud provider, or do you also need a third party to augment that?
So one of the things about this, whenever you're talking about these products, and I think that we all have to be very careful of, and I'm not specifically talking about CloudKnox or anything. If you talk about the Capital One breach, right? You see a bunch of vendors that'll come up with something that'll detect that specific style of attack. And do very good at saying, hey, we stop IAM attacks specifically like Capital One, and that resonates with a lot of CSOs, CIOs, and CTOs. As the technical people that listen to this show and watch this show, we need to constantly be asking additional questions like, that's a great example. Can you give me some other example attacks that you detect? And make sure that you push them beyond that news story. Because I'm finding with a lot of vendors, when we're testing them, they'll say, yeah, well, we detect this particular style of attack. We modify it ever so slightly and we get through. And that becomes a problem. So you'll see these product marketing groups that are basically saying, we'll detect what happened to Capital One, and they're only detecting that specific thread of an attack, which once again, I mean, I still have people that call me up, CISOs, and they're like, we've got to make sure that we're not going to fall victim to Apache struts. Like, what the hell? Why are you talking about Apache struts? It's like, well, that's what got Equifax. It's like, it's not quite how it works, but I can understand that risk model if you're not really aware of how the attacks work.
Right.
back to our vulnerability management discussion. Just apply your damn patches and you would have been fine. I think, but for this, I think this is interesting, right? Because this is the complexity in the cloud, is understanding all the services, what level of access these different services have, and really finding the blind spots, trying to figure out where you're blind. And so again, Amazon made a bunch of announcements. I think this IAM Access Analyzer is a great one because it will give visibility into all these different services that have interdependencies. I think that's great. Where vendors come in now is, okay, do you leverage this with your existing solutions and augment that for hybridized or multi-cloud environments? Maybe. If you're all Amazon, this is fantastic because you don't need anything else. But how many people are 100% Amazon? But I still think it's a good feature because it will put the pressure on Microsoft and Azure and Google and GCP to do things similarly to help in those environments as well, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what I see happening in the landscape, even in our own application, right, is, back in the day, John talked about 2005, right? I remember being in meetings 20 years ago and we were talking about how when we deploy an application that was on physical hardware, and there was like three components, right? There was a web server, an app server, and a database. We had physical firewalls and, device security devices like IPS in various points. We now take that application, break it up into about 20 different parts, put it all, in this case, in Amazon's cloud, give it all each its own unique service, and then try and figure out what should have access to what and what roles everything should have, and figure out when there's some kind of violation of that. Right? That's the problem that we have now. And we don't have all the right tools, as is evidenced by this announcement, to be able to truly understand that. And just taking that application, breaking it up into 20 parts and deploying it is complicated enough, let alone trying to understand all the roles and access in the cloud.
Well, and that also goes back to why when you go to Amazon, you can buy an entire stack. I use the Elastic Map Reduce research that we did, and we talked about it on the show about 7 weeks ago. That's all hard to get all of that crap working, but it's so much easier if you can just deploy the entire stack and it's just magic. But that opens up all kinds of additional security issues as well.
Right, because I think security the controls have to be much lower, right, more open, so that that works for a large number of people. If you were to say, oh yeah, you can build your own stack, but every time when your app needs to access something else, you have to go add a rule, that would be a barrier to entry for the product.
Yep, absolutely.
Let's see what else. Mimecast challenges shadow IT in cloud usage. Go ahead, John.
This one was awesome. I love this one. The idea of shadow IT, this is something we started talking about on the show, I think about a year ago. And now you got like Extra Hop is talking about it. Mimecast is talking about it extensively. And you're actually seeing products that are coming to bear on it. But the idea of having things like, rogue TeamViewer, RDP sessions, and VNC sessions, and all these things flying around in your organization is amazing. But here's the question. I asked this a year ago when we first started talking about this. Mimecast has the ability for that application visibility and control. How close do you think Mimecast is getting to Tenable's patents for passive vulnerability scanning at this particular point?
Right. I think there's a lot of things I've seen, John, that I feel like come close to the patent.
It gets very close. Even the acquisition Qualys did earlier this year in some of the passive stuff. I ran that. I managed that IP portfolio for Tenable, so I know there's some pretty good patent protections around some of the passive stuff. That's interesting. Again, it depends on how they're doing it. This is obviously augmenting what Mimecast already does from their email side, moving into the application side. I think this is great. But yeah, I guess, I'll let the patent lawyers figure out the other stuff.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
What else is in here that was interesting? Oh, Perimeter 81. I thought this was kind of interesting. It looks like their zero trust kind of SD, like software-defined networking package that you can basically, and I think the name speaks to it, right? Like wrap a perimeter around all of your devices and do that in software. And so their features they're announcing are allowing you to lock down the Wi-Fi, right, of things that you're deploying and things of that nature. I think it's kind of the next evolution of VPN. I think we've always had this kind of, capabilities, but this seems to be wanting to take it to that next level where we can have some control and visibility over the perimeter, even though our devices are all over the place.
Well, and that's one of the things we keep talking about. The perimeter is going away fast. Traditional Active Directory, DMZ, your Exchange servers, it's going away. Quickly moving into that perimeterless environment, or some people call it zero trust. And I know that sounds like marketing propaganda and hype. For the love of God, if you're listening to this show, you need to start looking at a perimeterless environment and a zero trust environment and what that actually looks like, because that's our architectures over the next 5 years.
Yeah, and how do these solutions like Perimeter 81, OpenVPN, and others provide some level of encrypted communication traffic in and out of these different environments, because it's not just your standard data center with your own VPN gateway anymore. I mean, we're talking about assets and applications running all over the place, right? And I think that's where Perimeter 81 and OpenVPN are doing some things innovatively to think about the problem differently than one big pipeline into a VPN gateway that only gives you access into your internal environment and then forces you to go out through a CASB to get to your applications in the cloud. That's so archaic, right? If these solutions allow that true distribution of the user to get to the assets they need in a very simple way, that's a really interesting solution.
Yeah, they said they have 36 global gateway locations now. So rather than funneling into one spot, right, the technology, like we learned from OpenVPN, allows you to distribute that.
Yep. And I mean, think about where this whole VPN thing is going, right? Eventually, you're going to be looking at APIs, you're going to be looking at cloud services that are explicitly shut down to just general scanning on the internet. That you'll be in a situation where you'll fire up your computer, you'll start up your quote-unquote VPN, and then as you access the services, that VPN is going to authenticate to that specific service before you can even talk to the ports and protocols on the other side. I think that's where we need to be, right? That'll shut down a lot of this.
That's very similar to that's a 6TERA that renamed to something else, right? Yeah.
Yep. And I think that there's a lot of products in this place that are coming up with some really innovative approaches that are, I think, brand spanking new in the way that we look at a perimeterless environment. And that's the stuff that gives me hope for the cloud, because right now the cloud is just a flaming garbage heap of crap being thrown out there. But if we can actually restrict that access as needed on a user basis, just not having it exposed, well, hot damn, that's where we want to be.
It kind of reminds me of like port knocking.
Yeah, exactly. Right? What's old is new, right?
Yeah.
So, and there's somebody listening to the show that's like, what the hell is port knocking?
Yeah. It's kind of like two-factor authentication, but not really. No. Not really. Yeah, it's... But not what 6TERA is doing, because the 6TERA is a lot more advanced than simple port knocking.
Oh yeah, shit. No, we don't want to say that's what 6TERA is doing. Not at all. Because there's a marketing representative that's losing his mind right now listening to the show.
Yeah, and I kind of liken that to, port knocking is what us nerds would play around with, similar to like PGP, right? We're like, this is great technology, and a lot of people created. There was one like really popular open source port knocking thing. It was basically a system where I could send a packet that had some unique characteristic that I defined, and once the system. What was it?
NOCD, I think.
NOCD, right? And it would say, oh, that's a packet that I recognize. Therefore, that IP address can now communicate on the SSH port, right? But if you didn't send that packet first, you didn't have access to the SSH port. But what 6TERA does differently is they tie in like really good authentication standards around that.
Yes.
So it's not just sending, anyone can send that packet if you can figure out what it is, right? And that's the difference that I think John and I were talking about.
Right. And what these systems allow you to do back to your zero trust analogy, right? It allows me to look at the application, the user, and the data and make specific rules about who can get to what, right? It may be a VPN that facilitates this. It could be something completely different. But to me, this concept of the network being the controller, the perimeter being the controller, the endpoint being controller, it's not quite enough, right? You need to understand the user interaction with different applications and locations, et cetera. And if you can model that out in a very effective, easy to deploy way, which maybe these guys do, I haven't dug into it, then we're getting to that point where a zero trust environment can actually work well for an organization. But I'm not sure we're 100% there yet.
Well, I think with a lot of this, when you're looking at APIs, locking down authentication, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, we're back to where we were in 2005 with a lot of the additional security technologies that we had back then. People are fumbling around in the dark, and some are going to hit, some are going to miss, and some will just get bought and disappear. But it's fun. I mean, and that's why I think Paul's been talking about it, because a lot of his research, just for the necessity of what he has to do on a day-to-day basis, has kind of, it reminds me of that time frame back in 2003, 2007 time frame. It's cool technology that's exploding all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Kind of along the lines we're talking about, Accepto made an announcement. There's a lot of things in here, but they're basically they say they're the provider of continuous behavioral authentication, and they've extended to offer a central authentication service with single sign-on integration. This kind of sounds almost like similar to Preempt in that space. The technology sounds different, but it sounds like in that space.
Yeah, similar space, I think, and there's a couple other behavior authentication vendors out there. I mean, this is a space that's been evolving over the past few years. So, and this is the first I've heard of Accepto, so I don't know how they're the leading provider if this is the first time I heard of it.
Right.
So what I'm going to say for this, and I have not tested Accepto that I'm aware of. We have not looked at it that I'm aware of, so this is a disclaimer. But a lot of these products that are doing the continuous behavior authentication, it's rate limiting underneath the hood. And I know I'm going to have a vendor that's going to be like, we're far more than that. Okay, whatever. But the ones that we've seen, you can take the time, the amount of activities that a user does within, let's say, a 2-minute window. And as soon as it starts clipping above that threshold, they lock you out because it starts to look like automated traffic at that point. So I think it's a really cool idea, but it seems like most of the implementations that I've actually seen were very basic rate limiting. And if you just slow down a lot of your attack traffic, you can bypass a lot of these different products, which is still good. It's still good if it slows down the attacker.
Right. It raises the bar.
I'll take that every single day, every single time.
Which means they're not using machine learning or artificial intelligence to do their behavior analysis.
Yeah,
they're just rate limiting.
You say they do, some of them don't, right? So I'm looking at Accepto, going through their stuff. They also look at browser attributes, because if the browser, with Beef, you can fingerprint a browser very quickly. So if a user is using a browser all the time, they're using Chrome, and then all of a sudden everything looks like Firefox and a base installation of Firefox, that would be something that would be different. So there's some cool stuff that you can do in this place, and I think this is very getting started, training wheels. But there's a lot more that vendors can do, and I really hope that these vendors get the opportunity to actually build this crap out to do more than just rate limiting.
Agreed. Any other news articles in there that looked interesting?
No, I don't think so.
Alrighty. With that, we will conclude this segment and come back with our first interview with Farah from NetSparker. Stay tuned.